You've probably heard of the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. Although they are not the first people who lived in Mesopotamia, they are the earliest known ethnic group that inhabited the region.
The red clay of southern Iraq held a secret that baffled every historian who ever lived for 6,000 years. When the world was still trapped in the Stone Age, a mysterious people emerged in Mesopotamia, building towering ziggurats and inventing the world's first written language. They called themselves the black-headed people, but we know them as the Sumerians. Where did they come from? For centuries, science was blind. Then the ancient DNA spoke, truth on real Sumerian origin. To walk through the sun-bleached ruins of Eridu or Uruk today is to step into a ghost world of dust and silence. But beneath this baked landscape lies the foundation of human history. Long before the first stone was laid for the pyramids of Egypt, and millennia before Rome was even a dream, the Sumerians were engineering an urban revolution. They did not merely settle the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they completely transformed it. Out of the chaotic, untamed marshes of southern Mesopotamia, they conjured a network of independent city-states that operated with a sophistication that seemed almost impossible for their era. They mapped the stars, divided the hour into 60 minutes, forged bronze tools, and created a complex legal system. Most revolutionary of all, they pressed split reeds into wet clay tablets, creating cuneiform, the earliest known system of writing. Yet for generations of archaeologists, this sudden explosion of high civilization posed a deeply uncomfortable problem. History is typically a story of slow, agonizingly gradual progression, but Sumer appeared on the historical stage with its culture, technology, and societal structures seemingly fully formed. It was as if a highly advanced blueprint had been dropped directly into the desert. For over a century, scholars argued passionately over what they called the Sumerian problem. One school of thought insisted that these brilliant innovators must have been invaders, an enlightened master race that migrated from some distant, unknown homeland to conquer and uplift the primitive local populations. Speculation ran wild, with theories placing their origins everywhere, from the rugged valleys of the Caucasus Mountains to the distant, misty shores of the Indus Valley. Every time an archaeologist brushed away the dirt from a new tomb, the same burning question echoed through the halls of academia. Who were these people, and from what far corner of the earth did they journey to ignite the dawn of civilization? For a very long time, the broken statues and silent tablets of Mesopotamia refused to yield an answer, leaving historians to guess in the dark. What the bones revealed would challenge everything we thought we knew about the cradle of civilization, the cradle of shadows. One must look at the archaeological layer cake of ancient Iraq to truly understand why the origin of the Sumerians became such an enduring obsession. Long before the Sumerians built their vast cities, the region was home to a prehistoric culture known as the Ubaid people. These early inhabitants were peaceful village farmers who created simple, beautiful pottery and lived in modest reed huts. They fished the marshlands, dug primitive drainage ditches, and buried their dead with simple clay figurines. For thousands of years, life in Mesopotamia moved at a glacial pace. It was a stable, predictable, and remarkably quiet existence. Then, around 4000 BCE, the historical record dramatically fractures. Almost overnight, in archaeological terms, the unassuming Ubaid villages were replaced by the staggering urban sprawl of the Uruk period. The modest shrines transformed into monumental temples layered in limestone and dazzling clay cone mosaics. The village councils were superseded by powerful, centralized monarchies. This sudden, jarring shift is what led early researchers to assume an entirely new group of people must have marched into the floodplain, subverting or conquering the indigenous population. These newcomers brought with them an unprecedented mastery of mathematics, architecture, and administrative organization that looked completely disconnected from the older Ubaid ways. Adding fuel to this historical fire was the neighborhood the Sumerians lived in. The Middle East has historically been dominated by Semitic-speaking peoples, from the ancient Akkadians and Babylonians to modern-day Arabic speakers. Yet when scholars finally cracked the cuneiform code in the 19th century, they discovered that the earliest tablets were written in a language that was utterly alien to the region. Sumerian shared no vocabulary, no grammar, and no structural roots with the Semitic tongues spoken just miles away. It was a linguistic island, completely cut off from the rest of the known world. This bizarre disconnect convinced generations of academic investigators that the black-headed people had to be foreigners. They looked like an intrusive element, a brilliant civilization that had migrated from some mysterious, advanced external homeland, bringing their completely unique language and technology with them to the banks of the Euphrates. For over a century, the hunt for this mythical ancestral homeland consumed the field of archaeology, turning up nothing but dead ends and fierce academic stalemates. Historians mapped out hypothetical migration routes, crossing through the treacherous passes of the Zagros Mountains, while others looked across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, wondering if fleet-footed ships had arrived at the mouth of the Persian Gulf bearing the founders of Eridu. Yet every physical artifact recovered from the dirt merely deepened the confusion, as the material culture showed a stubborn, undeniable continuity alongside the sudden political and technological leaps. The physical evidence was locked in a fierce debate with the linguistic evidence, leaving a massive, unresolved void at the very beginning of human history. To find where they came from, scientists had to look beyond the broken pottery and dig into the code of life itself. Whispers in the double helix. For over a century, the debate raged in a vacuum of physical assumptions, but the 21st century brought a revolutionary new lens to the ancient world: paleogenomics. Rather than relying on the stylistic shapes of broken pottery or the highly speculative migration routes of linguistic families, scientists finally gained the ability to extract and sequence DNA directly from the petrous bones of individuals buried millennia ago. When geneticists turned their sights toward the ancient Near East, they expected to find clear, dramatic genetic boundaries reflecting the sudden arrival of the Sumerians. They looked for a biological signature that would trace back to an exotic, distant homeland, perhaps a distinct genetic marker pointing toward the Eurasian steppe, the depths of the Caucasus, or the shores of the Indus Valley. Instead, the genetic code revealed something that left many traditional theorists completely stunned. The true biological history of Mesopotamia was not a story of sudden invasion, but one of deep, ancient continuity. When researchers extracted DNA from the skeletal remains of individuals spanning from the early Ubaid period right through the height of the Sumerian civilization, they discovered a profoundly stable genetic landscape. The Sumerians were not outsiders who had marched into the floodplain to displace the native inhabitants. They were the direct biological descendants of the people who had been tending the marshlands and domesticating animals in the region for thousands of years. The double helix revealed that the Sumerian genome was a complex, beautiful tapestry woven from local threads. It was a genetic continuum composed primarily of three ancient populations that had been intermingling in the Near East since the end of the last ice age: Iranian Neolithic farmers, Levantine hunter-gatherers, and Anatolian agriculturalists. Over millennia, these populations slowly melted together in the fertile crucible of the Fertile Crescent, creating a highly specific regional genetic signature. To confirm this deep local ancestry, geneticists also looked forward in time, comparing the ancient Mesopotamian data with modern populations living in the region today. The most profound connection emerged when studying the marsh Arabs, the Madden, who inhabit the vast, waterlogged wetlands of southern Iraq, the exact geographic heartland where ancient cities like Eridu, and Lagash once flourished. For thousands of years, the marsh Arabs have maintained a unique lifestyle, building magnificent arched homes out of giant reeds and navigating the waterways in slender wooden boats, echoing the exact architectural and cultural motifs depicted on ancient Sumerian cylinder seals. The genetic surveys revealed that the marsh Arabs carry an incredibly high concentration of this indigenous Mesopotamian genetic footprint. They are, quite literally, the living genetic heirs of the very people who built the world's first cities. The biological evidence proved definitive. There was no massive population replacement, no migrating master race, and no mysterious foreign invasion. The people we call the Sumerians grew directly out of the very soil and water they would eventually master. This genetic revelation completely upends the classic narrative of how civilization begins. For decades, the prevailing academic bias assumed that high culture required an external catalyst, a spark brought by advanced outsiders to civilize an area. The DNA has decisively shattered that assumption, proving that the staggering urban and technological revolution of the Uruk period was entirely an indigenous phenomenon. The local hunter-gatherers, farmers, and marsh dwellers did not need an influx of foreign blood to invent the wheel, codify the law, or develop mathematics. They possessed the intellectual and creative capacity to build the cradle of civilization entirely on their own, adapting to the changing environment of their native home. Yet, while this discovery provided a beautiful resolution to the biological identity of the Sumerians, it simultaneously exacerbated the deep historical paradox that has kept researchers awake for generations. By proving that the Sumerians were ethnically local, the genetic data stripped away the easiest explanation for their completely unique culture. If their bodies and blood belonged so entirely to the ancient soil of Mesopotamia, the mystery of their identity simply shifted from their veins to their minds. If their blood belongs to the desert and the marshes, how do we explain a language that belongs to nowhere on Earth, the language that flew alone? The genetic evidence brought a profound sense of clarity to the physical bodies of the Sumerians, but it simultaneously cast a stark, confusing shadow over their culture. If these people were deeply indigenous to the Mesopotamian floodplain, sharing their DNA with the surrounding Near Eastern populations, why did they speak a language that was completely, utterly isolated from everything else around them? This is the core of the Sumerian paradox. Normally, when a population shares a long genetic history with its neighbors, their languages show some degree of cousinhood, sharing structural roots, vocabulary, or phonetic traits. Yet, Sumerian stands alone on a linguistic cliff, showing no relationship to the Semitic languages of the Akkadians to the north, nor to the Indo-European tongues to the east, nor to any other language family ever recorded by humanity. So how bizarre this is, we have to look at how the language operates. Sumerian is an agglutinative language, which means it builds words and sentences by gluing together various prefixes and suffixes to a stable root word, like stacking building blocks. This structural mechanic is entirely different from the inflected Semitic languages that dominated the ancient Near East, which rely on changing the internal vowels of a root word to alter its meaning. When the later Akkadians adopted the Sumerian cuneiform script to write their own Semitic language, it was an incredibly clumsy process, like trying to force square pegs into round holes. The Sumerians had created a writing system perfectly tailored to a tongue that seemed to have no earthly relatives. This linguistic wall is what originally led early scholars to assume the Sumerians must have been foreign invaders, because it seemed impossible for an indigenous population to develop a completely unique linguistic framework in a vacuum. The resolution to this riddle requires us to rethink how languages survive and disappear. The fact that Sumerian is a language isolate does not mean it dropped out of the sky. Rather, it suggests it was the final surviving remnant of a highly ancient linguistic family that existed before the massive expansion of Semitic and Indo-European languages wiped the slate clean. For thousands of years, as diverse groups of hunter-gatherers and early farmers roamed the Near East, there was likely a vast, rich tapestry of independent language families. As certain groups adopted agriculture and expanded, their languages grew with them, slowly absorbing or erasing the smaller, localized tongues of the region. Sumerian was a glorious holdout, a linguistic fortress that managed to survive in the isolated, protective environment of the southern Mesopotamian marshes, preserving a prehistoric way of speaking that everyone else had forgotten. Therefore, the Sumerians did not bring an alien language into Mesopotamia from some distant, hidden continent. Instead, they were the keepers of an incredibly ancient local tongue that had been spoken in the region long before the Semitic tribes migrated into the northern valleys. They wrote down their thoughts, not because they were foreigners introducing a new culture, but because their highly complex, urbanized marshland society required a level of bookkeeping that memory alone could no longer support. Their unique language was a badge of their deep, undisturbed antiquity in the region. Yet this realization raises an even more profound question. If their language and their genes were so deeply rooted in this specific geography, what was the sudden dramatic catalyst that forced these isolated marsh dwellers to suddenly leave their old ways behind and build the world's very first cities? The answer to this riddle might not lie on dry land, but beneath the waves of a forgotten sea, the sunken Eden. To discover the catalyst for Sumerian civilization, we must look beyond the modern map of the Middle East and peer back into the dramatic environmental shifts of the post-Ice Age world. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the geography of the region was radically different from what we see today. Because so much of the planet's water was locked up in massive continental ice sheets, global sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. During this time, the body of water we now call the Persian Gulf did not exist. Instead, it was a vast, dry, and incredibly fertile river valley, a massive basin cutting through the desert, fed by the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karen rivers. This sunken valley, often referred to by geologists as the Persian Gulf Oasis, would have been one of the most idyllic habitats in the entire ancient world. While the surrounding plateaus of Arabia and Iran were gripped by arid, freezing conditions, this low-lying basin remained a warm, well-watered paradise. It was teeming with freshwater springs, lush vegetation, and abundant wildlife. For millennia, this oasis served as a central refuge for diverse populations of hunter-gatherers, early agriculturalists, and fishermen. Here, isolated from the rest of the world by rugged hills and harsh deserts, these groups lived, intermarried, and developed their unique agglutinative language. It was a stable world that endured for thousands of years, but it was entirely dependent on a global climate that was about to shift drastically. As the Ice Age drew to a close and the great glaciers began their rapid, catastrophic meltdown, global sea levels began to rise at an alarming rate. Between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, the ocean began to breach the Strait of Hormuz, slowly but relentlessly spilling into the low-lying basin. What followed was a slow-motion environmental apocalypse. Over generations, the rising waters swallowed thousands of square miles of prime real estate, permanently drowning the villages, hunting grounds, and ancestral lands of the oasis inhabitants. The waters rose so significantly that the entire valley was eventually submerged, transforming a fertile terrestrial Eden into the shallow marine environment of the modern Persian Gulf. This forced an immense, highly adapted population to flee the rising tides. Stripped of their homeland, these displaced groups had no choice but to migrate northward, following the retreating shoreline up to the tip of the newly formed Gulf. When they finally settled, they compressed into the narrow, volatile delta where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met the sea, the exact region that would become southern Mesopotamia. This was not a triumphant march of foreign conquerors. It was a desperate migration of climate refugees. They brought with them a deeply shared genetic heritage and an ancient language forged in the drowned oasis, ready to adapt their sophisticated water management skills to a challenging new frontier. This watery displacement may have done more than create Sumer. It may have birthed the world's oldest memory. When the flood reminds, the traumatic displacement from the Persian Gulf oasis did more than physically compress a diverse, brilliant population into the southern marshes of Iraq. It permanently seared itself into the collective psyche of human culture. Long before the Hebrews penned the story of Noah in the book of Genesis, the Sumerians were carving their own account of a catastrophic, world-altering flood into cuneiform tablets. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and the older Genesis of Eridu, they told of Utnapishtim and Ziusudra, wise men who built massive vessels to survive a divine deluge that swallowed the cradle of humanity. For over a century, modern historians viewed these tales as pure mythological fantasy. Yet when placed alongside the stark geological data of the post-glacial rise in sea levels, these ancient texts suddenly transform into the world's oldest surviving eyewitness testimonies. The true origin of the Sumerians requires no sensationalized extraterrestrial theories or exotic cross-continental invasions. The answer is far more profound. They were a deeply indigenous Near Eastern people, forged over millennia within a sunken coastal paradise. When their world was slowly swallowed by the sea, they carried their ancient language, their diverse genetic heritage, and their water management skills northward into the Mesopotamian floodplain. Forced to innovate to survive in a volatile new environment of seasonal floods and harsh marshes, they built the first cities, invented writing, and ignited the dawn of history. Ultimately, the Sumerians did not come from a mysterious foreign land. They emerged from a forgotten world that now rests directly beneath the waves. If this deep dive into the hidden origins of history intrigued you, hit subscribe to join us for the next one.